Hello my friends and welcome to the channel for another Escape from Tarkov video. I've finally worked my way up to max level traders, and that means it's time to take a look at some of the most tricked out and expensive weapon builds in Tarkov. I kinda suffered from choice paralysis while I was putting this video together, from the sheer amount of options when it comes to good builds at level 4 traders. And because of this, I'm definitely going to have to make at least one follow-up video about max level traders. There's a lot of good stuff available here, both old favorites of mine and new contenders for top tier maxed out weapon builds, so let's get right into it. To get this one started, I want to talk about what I think might be the ultimate PMC slayer in the 0.14 patch, the 7.62 MDR, which is better than ever before from a recoil and shootability standpoint. And for the first time in Tarkov history, this thing has access to larger mags than the normal 20 rounders. The 7.62 MDR has always been a good gun, don't get me wrong, but in the past, I always felt like other 7.62 rifles had a better recoil pattern. The MDR has always been great for ergonomics and the smaller size, but I found the SR25 and M1A were just easier to shoot most of the time. That is now firmly a thing of the past. After the recoil rework, the 7.62 MDR is actually kind of insanely easy to control even when firing in full auto, with very manageable horizontal and vertical recoil, even when you're looking at a magnified scope. To start this build off, you'll need to buy one from Peacekeeper level 4, and it's unlocked after completing Wet Job Part 4. The initial cost is pretty high at over $1,200, but since you don't need to swap out a lot of parts compared to other guns, overall the cost of this setup is pretty reasonable. My first addition is to put on a suppressor, and if you have max traders, the best option overall in my opinion is the KAC muzzle brake kit with the PRS QDC suppressor. This is easily one of, if not the best 7.62 suppressor in the game, and it conveniently has a good price point at Peacekeeper level 3 of only around $430. Just make sure that you get the muzzle brake kit and not the flash hider to attach this to, as it has much better recoil stats. Next, I add a pair of M-LOK rails to the handguard, and then add a grip and a light. For my grip, I think honestly the best overall choice for most people is the Magpul RVG since it's the most balanced. However, if you have the SE5 Express grip unlocked, that is slightly better but more expensive. For a little bit of extra ergonomics, I also add on a pair of backup iron sights, and I highly recommend you try out the new 25 round SIG Spear magazines in the MDR. Those extra 5 bullets might not seem like much, but 5 extra 7.62 rounds is nothing to laugh at. After this, all you need is a sight. My top picks for the MDR would be to use a holographic sight for close range maps, and then my favorite sight for longer range stuff in this patch is the Elcan Spectre scope, because of how much versatility it gets you for the price of $300 from Peacekeeper. Next up, let's take a look at a ridiculously expensive M4 build that can offer you some pretty insane ergonomics for a full-length suppressed rifle. This setup is over 350,000 rubles, but it lets you get up to around 70 ergonomics even with a suppressor. And even if you attach a drum mag and a big scope, you still get 50 ergonomics, which is pretty awesome if you ask me. While this build certainly isn't fit for everyone's budget, if you're independently wealthy in Tarkov, this is a nice addition to your armory. First up, we need to swap out some vital parts to get this build started, starting with the upper receiver. There's a few options here and they're all good, but on my build, I'm using the Novesk Gen 3 receiver from Mechanic level 4. Next, I replace the barrel with the Hansen 16-inch carbine barrel, which adds some extra recoil reduction without killing your ergonomics. After this, I swap out the gas block for the Ballistic Advantage Low Pro gas block from Skier, which gets you a good overall stat bonus. The last piece to start this off is to add an avalanche charging handle, and then all the core parts are done. For the suppressor, even with the high price of 80,000 rubles, I think the Griffin Armament M4 SD suppressor is one of the best choices you can make for a high level 5.56 build. This thing has great recoil stats, but more importantly, it has one of the lower ergonomics penalties of all the suppressors. After this, I add on the SAI 14.5-inch quad rail handguard for another big stat boost, and then I put a light and a Magpul RVG foregrip onto the handguard. Next, I replace the buffer tube with the SI Advanced Buffer Tube, which is unlocked at Mechanic after completing Gunsmith Part 21. If you don't have this, that's fine, you can just use the ATP buffer tube from Skier instead. Then I add on the MOE carbine stock and the rubber butt pad, which still all these years later is one of the best stocks in the game. If you don't have the rubber butt pad unlocked, I would recommend the Chris DS150 or the VL Tor E-Mod stock instead. For an optic, you have a million choices on a build as versatile as the M4, but for this build, I was trying out the Elcan HCO hollow sight and I enjoyed it. Finally, to finish this off and add more ergonomics, I put on the GFUEL S pistol grip and a pair of backup iron sights. When all is said and done, this is one of the priciest builds in Tarkov, but personally for me, getting 70 ergonomics with a suppressor is a pretty good trade-off for the price point. Next up, I want to take a look at something similar to the M4, the SIG MCX. This thing is one of my favorite weapons in Tarkov, and with the new CBJ ammo being sold by Peacekeeper level 4 at a pretty reasonable price, this thing is a solid choice for close quarters fights, as long as you can get a hold of ammo to use in it. After the recoil rework, the MCX is stable enough to go full auto at medium range now, and the ammo hits like a truck, so with the high fire rate, it drops enemies really quickly. The first and most important addition on the MCX is the suppressor, which attaches to the default MCX muzzle brake. This suppressor can be traded for one Raven statue at skier level 3, so you can get it at a pretty good price. Just make sure that you have the 3-port muzzle brake on the MCX for max recoil reduction when you're adding this suppressor. Next, for another stat boost, I add the longer 12-inch handguard onto the MCX, then some key mod rails, and a flashlight and a Magpul RVG grip. For the stock, first you need to add the MPX/MCX buffer tube adapter to add AR-15 stocks. I'm using the same setup I have on the M4 build I just covered, the advanced buffer tube, and then the MOE carbine stock and the rubber butt pad. Next, I swap out the pistol grip for the GFUEL S for max ergonomics, and I add a pair of backup iron sights for another ergo boost. Most of this build can be set up with level 3 traders, but you can't get the CBJ ammo until level 4 Peacekeeper, so really this setup comes into its own once you max out the traders. Next up for this video, let's take a look at the best compact AK Tarkov has to offer, the RD704. When it comes to good AK builds in Tarkov, this is one of the top contenders. And with access to 7.62 PP ammo at proper level 4, you shouldn't have too much trouble feeding this thing good bullets. The RD704 is sold by Mechanic level 4 for about 110,000 rubles. While this is pretty high for a base price, you only need to swap out a few parts in order to max out the stats on this thing. 7.62 AKs still aren't as stable in full auto as their 5.45 cousins, but this rifle is one of the best choices you can make for a 7.62x39 setup. First up, you can add the 7.62 NATO suppressors onto this thing, so a big upgrade is to add the KAC muzzle brake kit and then the PRS QDC suppressor for a huge recoil reduction. Next, you need a pair of M-lock rails to add attachments to the handguard, and then for a grip, I've been using the Osavets P2 foregrip for a little extra recoil control. To get an optic onto the 704, I like using the Bastion dust cover for the small recoil reduction. Then I add something like a holographic sight for most raids with this thing. For the stock, the best overall option is to go with the Zhukov S stock from Peacekeeper level 4, and for the pistol grip, I really like the Tango Down battle grip for a pretty cheap ergonomics boost. The finishing touch on this one is the RP1 charging handle if you want that extra +1 ergonomics, and then that basically covers it for this build. Now when it comes to 5.45 builds at max traders, there's a ton of options since the AK-74 has more aftermarket parts than almost anything else in Tarkov. And the RPK and AK-12 both have excellent simple builds as well. For my setup at max traders, I basically make a supercharged Zenitco AK-74M with the waffle suppressor. This suppressor is really expensive from Mechanic, but you can often find it on the market for around half price at 60,000 rubles, which I think is pretty reasonable. It mounts on the reactor muzzle brake, and the two combined give you an insane level of recoil control. Next, I swap out the handguard for the Zenit B30 plus B31, which has a good stat bonus and gets you lots of rails for attachments. This handguard also allows you to attach the Zenit B33 dust cover, which gives you more bonuses to recoil and ergo. While there are handguards that do have slightly higher overall bonuses, I like this setup because it works on full-size and compact AKs. So this build will basically fit any AK that you want it to, you just have to swap out the muzzle device based on the caliber. Next, I add a Magpul RVG foregrip and an X400 flashlight onto the handguard, and then I add a sight onto the dust cover as well. For the stock on my AK-74Ms and other modernized AKs, my go-to choice is actually still the PT1 Classica stock from level 2 Skier. Now that you can add the GP25 recoil pad onto this thing, it gets you the same stats as the PT3 stock, but for less money. For the pistol grip, I stick with the Tango down grip, and then I add an RP1 charging handle to finish the build off, and then we're done. And that basically covers it for my first crack at some weapon builds from level 4 traders. There's so many other setups to cover in future videos. I honestly feel kind of overwhelmed, but it's nice to have so many options instead of being stuck using only a handful of weapons that luckily happen to have good recoil patterns. In the next video covering level 4 traders, I want to take a look at some slightly more affordable options. But for this one, I just kind of decided to go crazy and said forget about the cost, let's just build something cool. I hope you enjoyed, and thanks for watching the video. I've got a link to my Twitch channel in the description if you want to come check out some of my Tarkov gameplay live. And until next time, stay safe in Tarkov City.